For more on the new KORUS trade deal, we are joined by Ferrier. He is the Director of Academic Affairs and Research at the Korea Economic Institute of America. Hi there, welcome to the broadcast.
Thank you for having me, Susan.
So we just listened to this. It doubles the amount of imports that can go into South Korea for cars, General Motors, Ford, others, but yet I think I read 11,000 cars at most have been sold by any of these American manufacturers in South Korea. So why is this?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with taste, and that's something that you can't really take into account by changing the trade agreement. South Koreans have a preference for domestic-made cars, and they are more U.S. cars are sort of competitive with Korean-made cars, and when they're trying to import foreign cars, they're looking to import luxury cars, and when they're importing luxury cars, they look to European markets. So it's intended to increase the amount of U.S. auto vehicles in South Korea, but at the same time, we'll have to wait and see how much the reduction of non-tariff barriers will actually increase U.S. auto exports to South Korea.
So it still faces the possibility, South Korea does, of U.S. aluminum tariffs. How do the two sides balance out here?
Well, I think that the intention is the aluminum tariffs are only about 10%, and steel tariffs from steel exports from South Korea to the United States were a bit more than that. And when we're talking about the whole reason for the KORUS renegotiations, it had to do with the bilateral trade deficit, and the bilateral trade deficit is 90% those. So I think that's why the U.S. focused much more on autos when it was talking in these negotiations, and most of the outcomes had to do with the safety standards, environmental regulations for autos, auto parts, the light truck tariffs, keeping that extended through 2041, even though Korea currently doesn't actually export any light trucks to the United States. It is looking longer term. So while the aluminum export tariff is still there, the U.S. and the Trump administration is still concerned more about the size of bilateral trade deficit.
So did the U.S. want to get something on the books and use this possibly even as a template or something to refer to, and especially with presumed talks coming up with the DPRK and needing South Korea as an ally?
Well, that's the purported reason for it, and I think this is a great opportunity that the Trump administration has tried to use to take advantage of a decreasing bilateral trade deficit with South Korea over the past few years and take some ownership of it, even though it's largely due to market forces. In the past couple of years, if you look at the goods and services deficit with South Korea, the United States it has gone down by nearly 40%. The bilateral trade deficit in goods, which is the metric that the president cares most about, is about $23 billion, and that's down from where it was a few years ago.
Why was agriculture left out of this?
I think both countries understood that it's very politically sensitive, and if they're trying to advance a trade agreement, that it should be left out. For Korea, this was the most contentious part of the trade negotiations early on, when the trade negotiation process required them to raise the issues in the National Assembly, their equivalent of Congress, and this agriculture was raised a number of times. So for the United States, if they really wanted to get concessions on autos, which was 90% of the deficit, they more or less seemed to acknowledge that this was more important and decided to pursue that route as opposed to trying to find a greater market for U.S. agriculture exports in Korea.
So the U.S. is still in talks, obviously, over NAFTA, the European Union, China. Obviously, a big point of contention, as we just covered before we introduced you in this segment. French President Emmanuel Macron criticizing the U.S. and the way this deal was done. Why is that?
Well, I feel like it was a way of, I've heard people term it as bullying, but I wouldn't necessarily go that far. I think it's the Trump administration way of trying to exact as much as they can and move on. And I think there's a very quick turnaround, and you mentioned North Korea before. As soon as they reached the deal, the Trump administration, including senior officials and the president himself in the tweet today, was very quick to stress the importance of the security relationship. That's very, very different from what we were talking about a couple weeks ago when the Trump administration was saying, oh, well, they're our so-called allies, but they're not our allies on trade. And that's turned around so quickly. And I think to dwell on the tactics, I think to reach the deal is counterproductive to what we have coming up, which is the North Korean summits.
And as he has been showing, would you say some favoritism in granting temporary exemptions to several of the U.S. allies that you were talking about?
No, it'll be actually interesting for the South Korean case because they said they would limit their exports to 70%, this quota from 2015 to 2017, which turns out to be about 2.7 billion tons. And 2.7 million tons. And it'll be interesting to see how other allies are able to negotiate these exemptions and what it means for South Koreans and how South Koreans will view how they were able to negotiate their exemption and what this will mean moving forward. Even though the deal is agreed to in principle, there are still things that need to be worked out moving forward.
Okay. Well, Kyle Ferrier, thank you with the Korean Economic Institute of America. Always great to see you.